As always, I want to start by acknowledging that unless you are indigenous to the land that you call home, you are occupying stolen lands. I want to express gratitude as guests on these lands and thank all of the original and current stewards. And given the topic of tonight's training, I also want to honor the fact that storytelling and public narrative are practices that have been used by Indigenous cultures for centuries and continue to be core tactics of many Indigenous-led resistance movements across the world. So when we look for inspiration and for masters in the art of public narrative, the first peoples of this nation are perhaps some of the greatest examples. So this website that I'm about to share in the chat is one that you can use to find out whose land you live on if you don't already know. It is certainly not comprehensive, but a really great place to start. So I encourage you to look up whose land you're on and learn a little bit about the treaty rights and the tribal sovereignty of the nations in your area. I am on the land of Coast Salish people, specifically Duwamish, Stillaguamish, and Suquamish, past and present. So why are we here? Great question. So we're here to talk about stories as a tool to be an effective leader and to grow movements for change. But why stories as a tactic? You might think you don't have a story that matters or that people aren't interested in the experiences that you've had in your life. But if you're engaged in public work, or if you're leading an organization, or you want to be a leader in your community, you have the responsibility to offer an account of who you are, why you do what you do, and where you hope to lead. And if you don't author your own story, others are likely going to do it for you. And at least in my opinion, that's not an agency that you should give away, right? So this practice of public narrative, of authoring our own stories, is so vital in leadership and movement building. And it's a practice that for years has proven to be a really invaluable tool for public leaders, for community organizers, for students and leaders across a range of different organizations, communities, and nations. So that's why we're here. And does anybody know who this guy is? Whoever can put the correct name in the chat gets a gold star. Anybody have any ideas? All right. Oh, Odds Popkin. So close. No, this is Marshall Ganz. He's one of the nation's leading organizers. In the early 60s, he dropped out of Harvard to join the civil rights movement in Mississippi. He later spent 16 years working with Cesar Chavez and the United Farm Workers before returning to Harvard to finish his bachelor's and earn a PhD in sociology. And he now teaches at the Harvard Kennedy School, and you might wonder why I'm talking about this dude. It's because the framework that we're using today and the language that we're using to talk about it were really formalized by Marshall Ganz and a lot of his organizing work. So I do want to give him a shout out, with the caveat and the note, again, that public narrative and storytelling has been used to build movements and community for centuries, and certainly predate Marshall Ganz's work, but he really did bring it to the forefront of the organizing world, at least in the West. So now that we're all clear as to why we're here, and you've had the chance to leave if this is not what you thought it was going to be, this is sort of how tonight's training is broken up. So first, we'll take a broad look at why we tell stories as an organizing tactic. Then we'll break down the structure of a good public narrative. And with this knowledge in hand, we'll actually spend some time and space to write and workshop our own stories of self. And then we will end with some reflection and opportunities to put your narratives to work, whether it's in the Washington Can't Wait campaign or in the other areas of your life where you organize and are active. But before we embark on this journey, I do want to offer just a couple of group norms to keep us grounded. The first is just to be present and take care of your needs. If you need to turn off your camera, to step away, get up, stretch, anything else, take that time. You are your own best advocate. I also want to invite you all to lean into challenge and discomfort. We will be asking you to participate in this training, not only by sharing your stories, but by giving others feedback. And this can be really scary. When I first attended a public narrative workshop and was asked to share my story in front of a group of people, I was super terrified. But through that experience, I really found myself surrounded by this incredible community who accepted me for who I was, who listened to my story, and gave me really gracious feedback in their dedication to my growth as an organizer and as a leader. And each time I find myself sharing my stories, it just gets easier and easier. And I think it is a really incredible way to connect and to build community. That all is to say that this job can be hard, but it's also really beautiful, and it does get easier the more you practice. So with that in mind, I also would like us to accept non-closure. What do I mean by this? Developing a public narrative is a really iterative process. It takes time and practice and good coaching to really become a master. I've been working with this tactic for years, and I still feel like I have a lot to learn. So just consider this training to sort of be your first step on your journey. And finally, I do want to recognize and respect and honor the diversity in this room, the diversity of identity, of experience, of comfortability, of knowledge. We're all coming from different walks of life. We all have something really meaningful to contribute to this space, and we are all welcome here just as we are. Why do we tell stories? Storytelling practice comes from a really long history of movement work, and stories are inherently tied to our ability to be compassionate leaders who others identify with and trust to follow. And to be effective leaders, to move others to join our movements and take action, we have to be able to tell compelling stories. So let's just pause here and think for a few moments about this word leadership. I'm going to ask you to put in the chat what characteristics or words come to mind when you think of the word leadership. Go ahead and share in the chat, and I'll read some of them out. So Elizabeth says to be more effective and motivating faith communities to change the public narrative around homelessness. That might be a listener, somebody who brings people together, somebody who has wisdom, integrity, courage. Yeah, these are all great. Yeah, absolutely. These are all, I think, really core characteristics of what makes a good leader, right? And as we all know, when aliens inevitably come to the earth, they're going to say, take me to your leader. And this is the same with every other human problem, right? In our organizing work, we need leaders who can say why they accept responsibility. In our state and in our nation, we need to be able to say we are able leaders. And public narrative really is at its core a leadership art. Leaders draw a narrative to inspire action across cultures, across faiths, professions, classes, and eras. So can I get a volunteer to come off of mute and read this definition? If you put a star in the chat if you want to volunteer, and I'll call on your name and have you read this definition off the screen. Any takers? Wow, or I can read it. Oh, Kate, there we go. Let's hear it.
Leadership, accepting responsibility for enabling others to achieve shared purpose under conditions of uncertainty.
Thank you, Kate. Yeah, right. So leadership is about accepting responsibility for enabling others to achieve shared purpose under conditions of uncertainty. And stories are wrapped up in every single aspect of this definition. You have to tell stories to explain why you're accepting responsibility, why you're here. That's the story that we call the story of self. We tell stories to describe shared purpose. We can write a shared purpose out on a piece of paper and think, oh yeah, that seems good. But when we convey that shared purpose in a story of us that speaks to our shared values, then we can really feel that connection and that purpose in our core. And enabling others to act, even in conditions of uncertainty, that's what we call the story of now. And that's how we communicate the challenge that we're being called to face as a community, why it's urgent, and what we can do about it together. So I invite you, if there's a part of this definition that really resonates with you, a phrase that speaks to you, go ahead and share it in the chat. I already see Janet says awesome definition. I agree. I think this really gets the core of what we do when we step up and accept the responsibility of leadership. So if there's an aspect, yeah, Veronica, enabling others, right? Like a good leader, like you empower folks to join you in your work and you recognize that you can't do it alone, right? So that enablement is so key. So this next blurb here is a quote from Charlotte Miller, who's the co-founder of the Finance Innovation Lab and head of training at the New Economic Organizers Network. And I think this is another really compelling testament to the power of story and its importance in movement building, right? So this reads, this work of authoring a compelling story about yourself, your community, and the need for urgent action is integral to creating movements. Without a common story, movements lack a narrative about why they exist, and they will fail to generate a sense of belonging amongst their members. So this really hits it home. This is why stories are so integrally, I can't say that word, connected to effective leadership. If we want to build sustaining and impactful movements, we have to create narratives for change that people can really see themselves in, right? So a truly powerful public narrative connects personal stories of struggle to larger social issues and mobilizes people into action by appealing to commonly held values and a shared vision for a better future. And in my opinion, public narrative is not just another tool in the organizing toolkit. It is really the tool to bring people together in community to fight for real change. And I don't know if you've heard of this fella, but someone who's really mastered the art of public narrative is former President Barack Obama. Whatever your political leanings might be, this man has really mastered this art. And so this is a clip that I'd asked folks to watch if you had time in preparation for tonight. But just in case you didn't get the chance to, and just because it is such a great example of narrative, we're just going to watch the first 6 minutes or so of Obama's 2004 speech to the Democratic National Convention. And so as we watch this, I want you to reflect on these questions on the right side of the screen. So is there a point when your heart wakes up as you're listening to him speak? What details or images or moments stick with you? And at any point in this speech, do you feel hopeful? And so as we're watching this, please, I invite you to make the chat a collaborative space, share the things that you're feeling. If your heart lights up, let us know. If there's a moment in this speech where you feel hopeful, share when that is. And we'll watch this all together and let me know if you can't hear it.
Let me express my deepest gratitude for the privilege of addressing this convention. Tonight is a particular honor for me because, let's face it, my presence on this stage is pretty unlikely. My father was a foreign student, born and raised in a small village in Kenya. He grew up herding goats, went to school in a tin roof shack. His father, my grandfather, was a cook, a domestic servant to the British. But my grandfather had larger dreams for his son. Through hard work and perseverance, my father got a scholarship to study in a magical place, America, that shone as a beacon of freedom and opportunity to so many who had come before. While studying here, my father met my mother. She was born in a town on the other side of the world, in Kansas. Her father worked on oil rigs and farms through most of the Depression. The day after Pearl Harbor, my grandfather signed up for duty, joined Patton's army, marched across Europe. Back home, my grandmother raised a baby and went to work on a bomber assembly line. After the war, they studied on the GI Bill, bought a house through FHA, and later moved west, all the way to Hawaii in search of opportunity. And they, too, had big dreams for their daughter. A common dream born of two continents. My parents shared not only an improbable love, they shared an abiding faith in the possibilities of this nation. They would give me an African name, Barack or Blessed, believing that in a tolerant America, your name is no barrier to success. They imagined me going to the best schools in the land, even though they weren't rich, because in a generous America, you don't have to be rich to achieve your potential. They're both passed away now. And yet I know that on this night, they look down on me with great pride. They stand here, and I stand here today, grateful for the diversity of my heritage, aware that my parents' dreams live on in my two precious daughters. I stand here knowing that my story is part of the larger American story, that I owe a debt to all of those who came before me, and that in no other country on earth is my story even possible. Tonight, we gather to affirm the greatness of our nation, not because of the height of our skyscrapers or the power of our military or the size of our economy. Our pride is based on a very simple premise, summed up in a declaration made over 200 years ago. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That is the true genius of America. A faith in simple dreams, an insistence on small miracles, that we can tuck in our children at night and know that they are fed and clothed and safe from harm. That we can say what we think, write what we think without hearing a sudden knock on the door. That we can have an idea and start our own business without paying a bribe. That we can participate in the political process without fear of retribution, and that our votes will be counted, at least most of the time. This year, in this election, we are called to reaffirm our values and our commitments, to hold them against a hard reality, and see how we're measuring up to the legacy of our forebears and the promise of future generations. And fellow Americans, Democrats, Republicans, Independents, I say to you tonight, we have more work to do. More work to do for the workers I met in Galesburg, Illinois, who are losing their union jobs at the Maytag plant that's moving to Mexico, and now are having to compete with their own children for jobs that pay $7 an hour. More to do for the father that I met who was losing his job and choking back the tears, wondering how he would pay $4,500 a month for the drugs his son needs without the health benefits that he counted on. More to do for the young woman in East St. Louis, and thousands more like her, who has the grades, has the drive, has the will, but doesn't have the money to go to college. Now, don't get me wrong. The people I meet in small towns and big cities, in diners and office parks, they don't expect government to solve all their problems. They know they have to work hard to get ahead, and they want to. Go into the collar counties around Chicago, and people will tell you they don't want their tax money wasted by a welfare agency or by the Pentagon. Go into any inner city neighborhood, and folks will tell you that government alone can't teach our kids to learn. They know that parents have to teach, that children can't achieve unless we raise their expectations and turn off the television sets and eradicate the slander that says a black youth with a book is acting white. They know those things. People don't expect government to solve all their problems. But they sense deep in their bones that with just a slight change in priorities, we can make sure that every child in America has a decent shot at life, and that the doors of opportunity remain open to all. They know we can do better, and they want that choice. In this election, we offer that choice. Our party has chosen a man to lead us who embodies the best this country has to offer, and that man is John Kerry.
All righty. Thank you all for sharing your reactions. So this is a really powerful example of public narrative, right? Obama is able to tell his story of self, to let us know who he is, where he comes from, what values have motivated him along his path. He connects those values to this larger us, this, the American people, calls us all to really clear action in this moment where our values are being tested through a presidential election, and is able to inspire hope along the way, right? He is a master orator, so, nobody's going to leave tonight being able to give a speech like that, but hopefully we'll have a better idea of the components that go into crafting a narrative that is just as powerful. So the initial challenge for an organizer or for anybody who's going to provide leadership for change is to figure out how to break through this inertia of habit to get people to really pay attention, right? In other words, how do we really enable others to achieve purpose under conditions of uncertainty? And part of this involves our heads, right? We need to have a winning strategy. We need to be analytical. We have to reflect on our experiences and our knowledge so that we can be strategic in our campaigns, so we can make a plan for how we're going to get something done. But have you ever planned an event, had like the perfect strategy, got the right place, a great agenda, incredible speakers, room for 30 people, and nobody shows up? Can you just raise your hand if that's happened to you, or you've been to an event that you're like the only one at and you're like, what is going on? So we can use our head all that we want, and we really do need to use our heads to execute successful campaigns. But what else do we need to appeal to motivate people to act? Put some ideas in the chat. Appealing to just people's heads and their analytical mind isn't going to necessarily inspire them. What do we need to also appeal to? Sense of community, heart, guts, feeling, passion. Yes, we need to appeal to the heart. Practicing leadership, enabling others to achieve purpose in the face of uncertainty requires that we appeal to both the heart and the head so that we can engage our hands, right? So we need motivation, we need strategy, and those two things together lead to action. So when we recognize the importance of appealing to the head and the heart, we can get people to realize why they want something to change, what their motivation is, what is their stake in this game, and give them a really clear pathway for how they can act to accomplish that change, right? What is their strategy? So that they really do feel empowered to act on behalf of shared values in community with other people. And because we use narrative strategy to engage the head and the heart, it both instructs and inspires, right? It teaches us not only how to act, but motivates us to act, and then gets our hands working and us excited to really be part of something greater than ourselves. So to use public narrative effectively in this way, we really have to understand that values inspire action by appealing to emotion, right? Values inspire action by appealing to emotions, because ultimately our emotions are signals about what we value. When we feel strong emotional reactions, often we're seeing something affirm or threaten one of our core values. So public narrative at its core is really about unlocking people's capacity for meaningful action, as I keep saying over and over and over again, because that's what we're trying to do. And it does this by giving us our tools to express our values, not in just these abstract words or principles, but as lived experiences that draw on emotions of ourselves and also on the emotions of other people. And so through narrative, we can show our values in action, which helps others to actually feel what matters to us, rather than us just kind of telling them what matters to us, right? So like, for instance, if I said to you, I value the environment, that's nice and all, but not super powerful. Like, it probably didn't evoke much emotion in you whatsoever. Now, if I told you that a story, right? If I told you a story about how I grew up in Pennsylvania in the heart of fracking country, and as I was coming of age, I watched the environment and the communities that I loved being destroyed by extractive industries, which empowered me to be an advocate for people and places that I cared about that couldn't advocate for themselves. That might evoke a different set of emotions, maybe, right? And if we do this effectively, we can appeal to values and emotions in others that will motivate them to join us in action. So again, I'm going to ask you to open up the chat and share some things that you value. So if you sit there and think, what are my core values? What calls me to the work that I do? What am I fighting for? What are those things? Go ahead and put some of them in the chat. Obviously, there's no wrong answers. Community, Katie values equity, a livable future for Nicole's daughter and for future generations. Community, resiliency, justice, a healthy environment, nature, natural spaces. Yeah, these are great. Keep them coming. So we really, joy, equity, sustainability, education that empowers, right? We need to know what we value if we have any hope of inspiring action in other people, right? If we can speak to our own values in an authentic way, that will appeal to the emotion in others, will get them to recognize and see their own values in us, and will move them to act. And what are some emotions now that keep you from acting on those values, right? We all have these things that we really care about, but we don't always do the things we know that we need to do to make a difference. So what are some of the emotions that keep you from acting on those values that you all just listed? Crippling fear of failure, introversion, fear, uncertainty, laziness, fear of failure, feeling overwhelmed, fear of ignorance, anxiety, exhaustion. I think that's an emotion, Christine. Not knowing when and how to speak, right? Uncertainty of the best time to act. Yeah, these are all really good, right? And so it's really important to recognize that when we talk about appealing to people's emotions through values, that there are some emotions that facilitate action and there's other emotions that inhibit it, right? So through storytelling, we really aim to appeal to people's values in a way that moves their emotion from those of stagnation to motivation. So the language of emotion really is the language of movement. Our emotions are constantly in flux and responding to things that we see and hear. And action is inhibited by feelings like inertia, fear, self-doubt, isolation, apathy, all the things that y'all were sharing in the chat. And it's facilitated by feelings of urgency, of anger, of hope, of solidarity, of this feeling that you can actually make a difference. And so really effective stories mobilize emotions of motivation, so these things we see on the right side of the screen, to overcome these emotions of stagnation that keep us in a place where we're just frozen and apathetic and feeling hopeless. So a good public narrative, right, turns these feelings of helplessness into feelings of agency. So I just want to ask you to put a star in the chat if you have ever felt this shift in emotion. So felt yourself moving from a place of stagnation and helplessness to hope and motivation. Yes. Lots of stars. Yeah, right. Most of us probably have experienced this shift and it feels pretty good, right? To go from somewhere where you're just feeling utter despair to like, I can do anything, right? And that is the type of empowerment that we can evoke in people through really effective narrative. And so it all comes back, this whole flow, this whole strategy, to seizing a critical moment, right, where you're facing a challenge, where something is happening in your community, you need people to act, and you use that moment to share a story that is grounded in shared values, that appeals to people's emotions in a way that motivates them towards movement and action. If you want to get people to move with you, you have to get them to feel, which we can do by telling really powerful stories in key moments. So now I just want everybody to pause for a second and think about stories in your life. So just close your eyes and try to call to mind a time when you heard a story that moved you. It could have been something you heard on TV or something you just heard from your friend last week. So just take a few moments, think of a story, bring it into your mind, and try to remember how that story made you feel. Now, if you feel so moved, if you have that story in your mind, if you're feeling those feelings in your body, again, let us know in the chat. How did this story make you feel? The last time you heard something that just motivated you? What did you feel? Compassion, anger, amazement. Impelled to act, sad and relieved. Yeah, right. It's amazing the really visceral emotions that just listening to somebody speak words can have, right? These narratives are so powerful. So now we know what a public narrative should do. We've all felt how a good public narrative makes us feel. But what is the structure of it, right? What's the secret sauce that gets us towards a narrative that has these kind of desired impacts? So we can think of public narrative as being comprised of three elements that I've already touched on before. So we have the story of self, a story of us, and a story of now. And woven through these stories of self, us, and now, we must also express from where we draw our hope, right? Because if we don't have hope and optimism that a better future is possible, then we've already lost, right? And our work is doomed. If we're not motivated by a vision and a belief that things can actually get better, then what's the point, right? So we really also need to be able to articulate where we're drawing our hope from. And so let's just kind of zero in on these one at a time. So first we have the story of self. So kind of imagine laser beams connecting my heart to your heart. That's what a story of self is trying to do. A story of self communicates the values that are calling you to act, why you're fighting. It should be a story that allows others to get you, to know you. Everyone has a really compelling story to tell. We've all made choices that have shaped our life's path. And so the key to focus on here is these choice points, right? We think back to these critical moments in our life when our values became real, when we had to choose in the face of uncertainty if we were going to take action to stand up to our values and to stand up to something that seemed like it was threatening them or not. So whatever point you choose for your story of self should act as your origin story, to express what has brought you to leadership in a particular moment. So when did you first start to care about these issues? Oh, whoops. Oh, sorry. I do have my camera turned off. Sorry about that, guys. Didn't mean to do that. Thanks for noting that, Kate. Apologies. The key focus right on these stories of self should be on choice points, critical moments in our lives when our values became real, when we had to choose in the face of uncertainty. And so whatever point you choose is essentially your origin story, right? You're trying to express to folks like, why am I here? Why am I taking a point of leadership on this issue? What brought me to this moment? What was the catalyst? So this is a way for you to share the values that define who you are not just as abstract principles, but as lived experiences. We all have stories of pain, or we wouldn't think that the world needs to be changed. We all have stories of hope, or we wouldn't think we could change it. And when we share our stories of self, we allow others to see us really authentically, to see our struggles and our triumphs. And through that, they can see themselves reflected, right, in our values and in our stories, and will trust us as somebody to follow. So, A Story of Self shares a moment that demonstrates why you've been called to serve or step into leadership that is rooted in your own values. And then we have The Story of Us. So The Story of Us introduces our shared values and experiences as a community, which connects your fight to the people you're speaking to. So this communicates why our community in particular is being called to act, and why we in particular have the capacity to lead. So just as with The Story of Self, the key choice points in the life of the community are those moments that express the values that underlie the work that you do. So if you think back to former President Obama's speech in 2004, this is when we start to appeal to our shared American values, our shared experience as Americans, and these things that we all believe in and that we hold dear, right? So the key with The Story of Us is to focus on telling a story about specific moments of choice or action that have shaped your community. Telling a story in this way really invites others to join you in that community, and it allows them to see themselves as really important parts of it. And often our story of selves really kind of overlap with our stories of us, right? We participate in many different us's, whether it's our family or our community or our faith organization or a profession, a nation, a movement. A story of us expresses the values and the experiences shared by the us that we're hoping to evoke at a given time, right? So it is really important when you're thinking about writing a story of us to be able to answer the question of who is the us that I am trying to appeal to? Who is the group of people that I want to call into action with me, right? So that is a key question to answer as you think about this portion of the narrative. So The Story of Us, like I said, it communicates why our community is being called to act, why we have the capacity to lead. It brings us together in those ways. And then finally, we have The Story of Now. So The Story of Now is what roots us into the present moment, right? It articulates a really urgent challenge or threat to the values that we share as a community, and it really demands our action. So why is this issue you're fighting for so urgent? What is at risk? How does it threaten our shared values? What choice do we have to make? Where's the hope in all of this? And really importantly, what specific action can we take to stand up to this challenge right now? So in A Story of Now, this is really where the story and the strategy start to overlap. Because a really key element in hope is to have a strategy, a really credible vision of how to get from here to there, right? So the choice offered can't be something like, we all gotta be better people, or we must all choose to do any one of these 53 things, right? Which just makes each of those 53 things pretty trivial. A really meaningful choice is something more like, we all have to choose right now. Do we commit to boycotting the buses until they desegregate or not, right? It has to be specific. Hope is not an abstract thing. So A Story of Now should communicate the urgent challenge to our shared values that demands action, and how we find hope to face those challenges through specific actions. So these are kind of the building blocks of an effective public narrative. And I just want to pause here. Does this make sense, these three elements and sort of the goals that each of them are aiming for, the parts of the narrative that they form? Does anybody have any questions about The Story of Self, The Story of Us, The Story of Now? Feel free to ask them in the chat, or if you put a star in the chat, I can call you to come off mute and ask your question. Anybody? Alrighty. Well, if any questions do arise, feel free to pop them in the chat. We can also obviously always connect after this training. I'm happy to talk through the structure in more depth. So each of these components, the story of self, the story of us, the story of now, should be based in a narrative structure that highlight a challenge, a choice, and an outcome that are all grounded in our values and in a source of hope. So this is the structure and the narrative arc for any good story, right? I'm sure many of us learned about this challenge, choice, outcome in middle school English. A good plot, right, always begins with an unexpected challenge that confronts a character with an urgent need to pay attention, to make a choice. That choice yields an outcome. The outcome teaches us a moral. And because we can identify with the character, we can really feel that moral, right? We not only hear about somebody's courage, but we can also be inspired by it. The story of the character and their effort to make choices encourages listeners to think about their own values, their own challenges, and inspires them with new ways of thinking about how to make choices in their own lives, right? So the story of self, the story of us, the story of now, they all should have these three components of a challenge, a choice, and an outcome. So now, with all of these sort of structures in mind, the components of a good public narrative, the feelings it should evoke in us, we're going to listen to this narrative by James Croft, who in this video is speaking at an LGBTQ rally at Harvard in 2010. James is or was a student of Marshall Ganz, who is the person who really formulated this story of us, story of self, story of now framework. So we're going to watch this. It's a really powerful story. And as we're watching it, I want y'all to try to identify the structures that we've just been discussing. So you might want to bring out a pencil and paper or pull up a note sheet on your computer. And as you listen to this story, I want you to try to identify James's story of self, story of us, and story of now. Because after we watch it, we're gonna break it down together and see if we can figure out where all of these parts came into play. And then also just pay attention to what this story evokes in you. Like, is there a moment when your heart wakes up? What emotions do you feel? So we're gonna listen to this and discuss it. It's only about 5 minutes long. I do want to preface this by saying he does speak about suicide and about bullying in his story. So if those subjects might be triggering for you, please do what you need to take care of yourself, even if that means muting or turning your sound all the way down so that you don't have to listen to this. That is totally fine. I do just want to flag that for folks. So we'll give this.
Wow, that works. Amazing. 6.12 seconds. That's about how long it takes to fall 604 feet. And 604 feet is about how far Tyler Clementi fell after he jumped off the George Washington Bridge. Now, as we know, he took his own life because live video footage of him having a romantic encounter with another man was streamed live on the internet by his college roommate. Just one of a very long list of young people who have taken their lives because of anti-LGBT bullying in the past few weeks. Now, I never experienced anything like what Tyler went through when I was at school, but I was bullied for being gay. You see, when I was a kid, I was a ballet dancer. And every week I squeezed into a leotard and blue shiny hot pants. It was quite an outfit. And I spent an evening practicing demi-pieds and pirouettes. And I loved it. I loved the discipline. The music played on the old piano, the feel of the wood beneath my feet. I even secretly quite liked the outfit. But my schoolmates and some of my teachers didn't like ballet as much as I did. And one of my teachers, a PE teacher, used to make fun of me. He used to say how girly I was, how dancing is not something that a boy should do. I remember the sneer on his face as I walked past, and I remember that he was the first person to call me a fag, which at 7 years old, I didn't really understand. I remember in high school how gay was only ever used as a term of abuse. And I remember one cold morning sitting in assembly, while the principal intoned, "Homosexuals deserve our pity and our prayers." And I sat among hundreds of other boys thinking I was all alone in the world and that I was the only one who had this problem. Now, not everyone may have experienced something like that, but we all know, I think, what it means to feel alone, to feel like there's no one on our side. Perhaps you were too tall and the short kids made fun of you. Or perhaps you were too short and you got it from the taller ones. Or perhaps you were too smart or too dumb, or from the wrong side of town, or the wrong race. We all know, I think, even if just for a moment, what it feels like to think that there's no one on your side, to think that no one has your back. And all of us, if there are young people in our lives that we care about, can agree that we don't want this to happen to them. Imagine, if you can, what it must be like to come home and see a strange shape hanging from a tree in your backyard, twisting in the wind, the creak of the branch as it bends beneath the weight, and that feeling in your gut as you get closer and you realize what it is hanging there, who it is, who it was. Because that was Seth Walsh, 13, who hung himself from a tree in his backyard. It was Billy Lucas who hung himself at his grandmother's house. And it was Raymond Chase who hung himself in his dorm. And it could have been your brother, your sister, your son, your daughter, or your friend. It could have been one of us. So I know, I only came out in March this year, after 10 years after I first told my parents that I thought I was gay. And in those 10 years, I lost a lot of opportunities to make a difference. I was a high school teacher, and every day I wasn't out was a day I deprived a gay student of a positive role model. And I'm not willing to waste any more time. I have to act now. We have to act now. Because it isn't enough to let these things happen and then mourn them afterwards. We need to catch these kids before they jump. And there is something we can do to help as a start. Journalist Dan Savage has started a campaign, the It Gets Better campaign, to send messages of hope to teenagers who are being bullied because they're gay or for whatever reason, that they should have hope for their future, that they do have something to live for. And I think that if we made such a video, as Harvard students with glittering careers ahead of us and sparkling degrees, then we could make a difference. So we need people to hold a camera, to share their stories, to do editing and sound, to stand in a big group and say it gets better. No contribution is too small. And if you want to get involved, and you're an undergraduate, talk to Tevin here. Do you mind waving?
Oh, hi.
And he'll tell you how to get involved. And if you're a graduate student, or if you just want to come along, from 5 to 7 p.m. in the Elliot Lyman Room in Longfellow Hall at the Education Schools campus, stand up and say, we're standing with these kids. We've got your back. Let's catch them before they jump. Thank you.
Okay, so there's a lot in that story, so just take a moment, take a deep breath. A lot of inspiration, but also I just want to acknowledge that a lot of feelings could have been evoked from that narrative. I know every time I listen to it, it really hits me really deeply. So thank you all for listening to it. I hope if you hadn't heard it before, I hope that it was inspiring to you. And we're going to take a little bit of time to chat about it and break it down and see if we can identify the story of self, us, and now in James's narrative. So let's start with the story of self. And I am going to ask folks to come off of mute to share here. If you'd rather share in the chat, that's fine. But when did we hear James first learn that something wasn't right with the world? When did he make a choice to do something about it? How does that play into what he does right now? So if anybody wants to come off mute to share what you thought James's origin story was, put a star in the chat and I'll call you to come off of mute. Go ahead, Elizabeth.
I thought that his story of origin begins with the dance group and the bullying, the being called girly and a fag.
Yeah, definitely, right. So his upbringing, right, this feeling that he was the only one who was different and that in some way that was wrong, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Great. And within this story of self, right, so it's not necessarily one single moment that he shares, and it doesn't all happen all at once within his narrative, right? So there's another moment that comes a little bit later on in the story, a little bit later on in his life, that's very much so part of his story of self, and this moment when he realized he needed to do something because it wasn't right that he was being made to feel the way that he felt. Does anybody remember when that was? Yeah, Andy.
There we go. Okay. He talked about the assembly in high school with the principal talking about homosexuals.
Yeah, right. So being really singled out, feeling like he wasn't of value, right? And then there's this moment later on when he talks about the fact that he only just came out publicly within the last year, and that was 10 years after telling his parents that he was gay. And sort of like the reason that he made that decision, right, is because he spent 10 years as a high school teacher, and that every moment he realized that he didn't come out and he wasn't a source of inspiration for a kid who was experiencing the same feelings he felt when he was younger was a moment of opportunity that was lost, right? So he was faced with this challenge to really confront his own identity and recognize that he could be the source for hope and inspiration for folks who are feeling things that were the same, the same as him. So yeah, so that's James's story of self. And so now let's pivot to the story of us. So what was the point in his narrative where he started to appeal to the community when he spoke to the story of all of us, right, in some way? So when was that? How did he do it? Do you remember what language he was using? Again, put a star in the chat if you have any ideas on when he started to appeal to this, story of us. Go ahead, Peter.
I think in the beginning, he kind of established that he was I think he was speaking to a crowd, to a crowd of folks that were also likely gay or in the LGBTQ community. And so and he did that by talking about the clothing. And then I think later on, then more specifically, he was referencing the privilege that one has when you go to an institution like Harvard using, he said, called the glittery diploma, and to basically say we to build on that, the shared experiences of getting bullied, and then to say we now have a privilege and an opportunity and thus an obligation because we're at this place. And I think he drew upon what it means to go to an institution like Harvard.
Yeah, great. So you definitely, it was really clear, right, who the us was he was talking to, right? And that was other Harvard students. And I'm curious if, in addition to that, does anybody remember if there is a way that he appealed to the shared values and sort of emotions of that greater us in his narrative? Yeah, go ahead, Andy.
Well, that whole notion of not just reading about or hearing about the news of a gay student who jumped off the George Washington Bridge, but very making it very personal about coming home and seeing someone someone you love in a tree or in a closet. So that was sort of in my, still now, but in your gut, us, we have all experienced this, or we could easily imagine it if there's anybody in our lives who is different, bullied, not necessarily gay, but certainly if you know someone in your life who was gay in a youth, you've got that fear, and boy, that's a very strong us.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Elizabeth, yeah, did you want to share something as well? You might be on mute.
I'm sorry. I
Okay.
was saying, Mia Brett said it well in the chat.
Mhm.
It was this part of feeling alone, feeling different, feeling, less than. And regardless of whether you identify as straight, gay, trans, whatever, you felt that.
Yeah, exactly. I think, Mia said it well, you're right. That was really the moment, right? It's like you don't need to be, have had experience of feeling like you're the only gay kid in your school to know what it feels like to be the odd person out, to be the only one, to feel profoundly lonely. And then hand in hand with that, what Andy was saying, this sort of like, we hear these stories about these kids that have experienced these things, and that could easily have been, your friend, like your friend's kid, like easily could be somebody who you knew. And we shouldn't want, you wouldn't want anybody you care about in your life to feel this way. So, what can we do about it together, right?
Mhm.
Great. Yeah, I think y'all really hit the nail on the head with the story of us. And so that really brings us then to the story of now. So when did he call us into action? How did he show us that this problem was urgent right now, not in the past? And and was he specific? We talked about like hope needs to be specific. It cannot be some abstract call. So did he give a specific call to the community to motivate them to take urgent action? Again, put a star in the chat if you have any ideas or want to share. Maybe some folks who haven't shared out loud yet. Go ahead, Nicole.
So, well, what Terry just said is that join like his campaign now, their group now, so that you can stop people before they jump or hurt themselves.
Yeah, exactly right. We have to catch them before we fall, and we can, right? So, and I think he made it urgent. He brought this into the now by being, naming the really specific people that they had lost to suicide in the last year, and being like, but there is this initiative that we can plug into, pulling in what Peter said, like that we as people in this point of privilege, like we are in a position that we can actually make a difference here and be, in this place at this time, talk to this person right here if you want to get involved to do this really specific thing, right? It gives people a really clear way to plug in and turn those emotions they might be feeling of anger and urgency and sadness, into action, right? So that they can actually feel like they are doing something to address them. And that is so, so, so key. And I might have kind of already touched on this, but as you're listening to this, how did you feel like hope came into this narrative, right? If he thought that everything was totally broken, he would just be stuck. He'd be feeling doubt, isolation. Where does he get his sense of hope? You can either just put it in the chat. Go ahead, Peter.
I think he offers his own story as that example of hope, and that like he spent 10 years closeted and not speaking out, and then he's saying I've come forward, as if to say like you might be in that situation now, but you can still make a difference, and it's not too late to still make that difference. So I think his story was that source of hope.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. Like there's hope in his decision, like after all these years, and like the regret that maybe he's been feeling for not coming out sooner, that like now is the time, and this is it's crucial, and that there's a lot of work that can be done, right? yeah, so I hope that this exercise, listening and breaking this down, kind of helped you all to see how these structures can really fit together in a narrative. And I will say with these, you know, the story of self, the story of us, the story of now, like there's a reason that they're in this kind of circle structure on my screen right now. You know, these public narratives, they have no set like linear path. Like you don't have to start with a story of self and then move to a story of us and a story of now. Like you could start with a story of now, being like, you know, hey, the climate crisis is knocking on our doorstep. Like if you were here in Seattle last summer, you felt the impacts of wildfires and heat waves. You know, you can start with that like urgent hook, right? And then move into like, why is it that I'm being called? Why does this, you know, threaten us as a community? So there's no one way that all of these things piece together. I just wanted to, you know, just in case anybody was wondering, make sure that I said that. You know, these are very fluid parts, but they're all really vital portions of a really effective narrative. And finally, so just in case we haven't already talked about values enough, really just think about how values tied into every part of Jane's story, right? The story of now, the story of us, the story of self, they're all connected by these thread of values that are driving us. So why you're here, who we are, what we must do. These values are really the foundation of a really powerful narrative, a narrative that's really grounded in hope and a vision for a better future. So we're going to get into crafting our own stories of self. And I think we're doing pretty well on time. So I'm going to offer like a 5-minute bio break. So if folks need to go to the bathroom, if you want to grab water, a snack, anything like that, let's meet back here at 7:48. And make sure you have your worksheet handy. So the Story of Self worksheet, I'll post it in the chat again. If you want to open it up and make a copy of it, we'll be working in this sheet as we develop our stories of self. So let's be back here at 7:48, and we'll get moving and grooving together. And feel free to hang out here if you want. Otherwise, we'll see you in a couple minutes. Go take care and do what you need to do. I'll play a little music while we wait.
Driving through West Virginia, and I've seldom been thinner, with that chip on my shoulder. And this past year I got so much older. Looking back over my life, spent the most of it tongue-tied. And I wish I'd had more time listening to you speak your mind. Now I'm thinking about it every day, on my mind a typical way. Are you a life force? Thinking about it every day, on my mind a typical way. Are you a life force? Drinking coffee black as iron, and I couldn't be much higher without falling out of my chair. I've been so numb for so many years. Now I'm thinking about it every day, on my mind a typical way. Are you a life force? Thinking about her every day, on my mind a typical way. Are you a life force? And it's so easy to be blinded by the light. dust in my eyes and rust in my mind. I'll be home come next spring. Won't you say you love me later, by and by? Looking back over my life, spent the most of it tongue-tied, pulling my belt tight. It's just me and the stars tonight. 2 fingers and a tight line, keep my head above the alpine. Wish I'd spend more time listening to her speak her mind, thinking about every day on my mind a typical way. Are you a life force? Thinking about
Alrighty, welcome back, folks. Hope you all took some time to take care of yourselves. I'm just realizing you can't really tell in this light, but I went to the bathroom during this break and I was eating a blueberry smoothie before I started this session and just realized that like my tongue and lips are totally dyed blue. So just so you know, this isn't what my mouth usually looks like, if you noticed. Anyways, so now this is where the real fun begins. We are gonna dive in for the rest of our time together and work on crafting our own stories of self. So how this is gonna work is I'll set y'all up with just sort of a few tips and things to think about, questions to ask yourself. And then we'll take 15 minutes to start. I know this is not a long time. Like I said, this is just the first, step on this journey to crafting a public narrative. But we'll take 15 minutes for you each to work on your own story of self. And then we will have time for y'all to go into small breakout rooms and share your stories or what you're thinking of for a structure for your story of self and get some feedback from other folks in the room. So hopefully it'll be fun and exciting, maybe a little nerve-wracking, but that's good. It's good to get out of our comfort zones. So just as a reminder, when we craft a story of self, we want to think about how to incorporate challenge, choice, outcome, and then this sense of hope and values that really ties it all together, right? So on your story of self worksheet, which again, you should be able to access in the chat, if you scroll to the second page, I believe you'll see the start of some different questions to sort of help you work through these different elements of your own story of self. So let me know actually in the chat if you have problems accessing this worksheet or don't know what I'm referring to. Let me know and I can screen share it to help orient you a little better. So the second and third pages of that sheet are where you will work on crafting your story, either in the sheet itself or on a piece of paper. And something I just want to invite you to reflect on as you start to develop this story is what calls you to leadership, right? Like you're all here probably because you're interested in public narrative and the ways that it can help you be a more effective leader in your community, to work on whatever issues whatever issues that you work on. So for folks who are advocates with the Washington Can't Wait campaign, this could be the first time you felt called to become an advocate for the issues the campaign works on. You are here to do this work, but why? What was the first time you acted on your values that started you on a pathway to leadership to address the climate crisis or the housing crisis or environmental justice or racial equity or any other issue that you might care about and work on? Where did that journey begin for you? What is your origin story? What is that moment when these values really started to awaken in you and you, for the first time, really had to make a choice on whether you're going to act on them or not? So that's just something to kind of keep in mind as a framing question as you begin to think about what moment you want to choose to talk about for your story of self. And so with this exercise, like I said, we're really trying to get to your origin story. What brings you to leadership? A story that allows us to know you, to understand how you came to hold the values that you do, what calls you to leadership, what motivates your work. And so here are just a few tips to keep in mind for crafting your story. And I'll keep these up on the screen while we work. The first is to focus on a clear challenge that you have faced, and to really articulate what made it a challenge. Why was it difficult? And a note about challenge, like this doesn't have to be, the most traumatic experience you've ever had. It could be a challenge that you picked for yourself, like climbing a big mountain or traveling alone, or, it can be anything. It doesn't have to be something horrible, but, be able to explain why it was challenging, why it pushed you in a certain way. The second tip is don't tell about a story, tell the story. So what I mean when I say this, like just for example, telling about a story would be me saying, when I was little, I ate a lot of cake and it made me sick. Versus me telling the story, which would be something more like, on my 7th birthday, I ate a huge piece of cake and it made my stomach so upset that later that night I threw up and the chunks were brown, just like the cake. And it was the worst stomach ache I've had in my entire life, right? I'm bringing in more details, more feelings that I was having in that story, that is evoking feelings of grossness from Peter. So that's kind of what we want to get at, and that distinction between telling about a story and really telling the story itself that makes people feel like they're there with you. We really do all have valuable experiences to share. It can be hard to think about this because you might ask yourself, like, have I really ever faced a moment of challenge that I could share about? What's something important that I have to share? Why would people care what I've been through? But I like to think of us all as fish kind of swimming in the water of our own experiences. So sometimes you don't even realize that you have so many valuable moments in your life. So I'm just here to tell you that you have so much that we want to hear about. And the part of the challenge of the story of self is finding and digging and figuring out what those moments are. It's also really powerful to connect with the people you're speaking through vulnerability. And being vulnerable really helps people to emotionally connect with you, to trust you. And we want to be authentic and honest in our stories of self. With that being said, please don't share your trauma if you're not ready to. I know sometimes the first moment you might think about that's vulnerable is something really traumatic, but I definitely do not want to push you all to share those things if you're not in a place where you feel ready to do so. And then focus in on a few detailed moments. Make sure to include a challenge, a choice, and an outcome, and where you found hope. So those are the tips. We're going to take the next 12 minutes to start and you're going to try to craft a 2-minute story of self. I know this isn't a lot of time, so just do your best and really lean into this idea of non-closure. Again, this is a process. We're all along for the ride. And after we craft our stories, we will go into breakout rooms and share what we've come up with and get some feedback from our friends.